Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. In our last couple episodes, we've been really diving into some of the fascinating areas of the brain and how they developed. In our last episode, though, we kind of took a little bit of a detour because ultimately we're going to make our way into sensation, right? But before we talk about today's topic, which, spoiler alert, is all about hearing and balance, we kind of had to talk about waves.
Hmm.
So we got into the physics of sound waves and light waves, actually, last episode. Now we're coming back to the brain to talk about how those sound waves are actually basically encoded by our sensory receptors within our ear and then ultimately transmitted to our brain. So, super excited to get into hearing and balance.
Hearing. We're kind of like, we say hearing imbalance because you're like, Mike and Molly, you might be thinking like, okay, why are we combining hearing and balance? Like, okay, hearing makes sense. We're talking about sensation. We just talked about waves and sound. Hearing makes sense. Why are we talking about balance? Because since we're already in the ear, there's a lot the ear does. Because a lot of times people only think, oh, ear, hearing, duh, that's
Hearing,
all
yeah.
it does. However, there's also a really cool function on how it helps with our balance. And we'll dive into that today. But the real MCAT topic we'll be focusing on, like the big one, definitely is hearing, right? And again, it is really cool, like you talked about before, because we have all of these sensations, right? We talked about waves having all of these traits with frequency and loudness, but those are just traits of the wave. But we need to figure out how do we communicate or translate those traits into things our brain can actually understand, which ultimately, the only language our brain understands is action potentials, is electrical signals. So we need to turn essentially these mechanical stimuli and waves with the different amplitudes, different frequencies into electrical signals, and that's the job of the ear. And we'll talk about that today in today's episode. So, yep, super excited because it's just one of those topics that also combines a lot of different content areas, right? Anytime the MCAT has any sort of area, I know some big high yield ones we've done episodes on before, like especially like the bicarbonate buffer system and respiration, because you can talk about acid bases, blood pH, like physiology, lungs, kidneys. Anytime you have a topic that corresponds different content areas or crossovers, the MCAT loves talking about that.
Yeah.
Hearing is not an exception to that because we can talk about stimulation when in terms of like, oh, our channels or mechanoreceptors and ion channels. We can talk about action potentials. We can talk about waves and physics. So anytime you can have these crossovers, the MCAT's talking about it. So if you are listening here, we're talking a high yield concept today.
Most definitely. And I
Mhm.
love that. And that's what makes the MCAT so hard to study for is like the topics that are the most tested are the ones that are covered in every subject
Mhm.
and that can all be united in one passage. The second you started talking about that, I was like, redox.
Oh
Redox
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
everywhere.
yeah.
All of metabolism, but
Hmm.
also electrochemistry and
Hmm.
I love those topics. But
Hmm.
yeah, this is a huge one, all about physics. You can even get stuff with psychology. Talk about
Yes,
like,
yeah.
yeah, there's a lot.
Hmm. Hmm.
Signal detection theory, you could talk about like whether people will say they've heard something. It's a pretty fun thing. So let's talk about it, right?
Hmm.
Of course, again, in our last episode, we talked all about the science of waves. So the actual physics basis for how waves work. Now we're talking how does that sound wave, which we understand is essentially a vibration, right? A transmittance of energy throughout a medium. How does that end up being detected, right? How does that end up being understood by the brain? And how are we going to respond to our environment in a way that addresses that? Which is super, super cool. So let's talk about hearing in kind of from a bird's eye view, right? Or a
Hmm.
bird's ear
Ear
view.
view? Do birds have ears? Do they
Bird's
have?
eye view. They do. I mean, hey,
They have
we'll
to
talk about
hear.
a little bit of evolutionary biology
Oh, of
here and
course
how
we will.
critical hearing is. You need to know how to orient to your surroundings. It's why you have two ears and not one. You need to be able to have directional understanding of sounds in your environment. Birds still need that. They must have ears.
Or some
I don't know what they look like. I
homologous
wish I
structure
did.
to ears. But yeah,
But
when it comes to ears, right? If we're looking at a bird's ear view of it, you're gonna break it down into like
birds.
I'm not letting that one go.
Yes,
There's
bird's
three
ear view.
stages, right?
Yeah.
So there is that initial stage with the wave, bringing that like that transmission, that energy, when that's the job of kind of what we'll call the outer and middle ear. And we'll dive into these sections. We're going to dive in just a little bit what these means, but there's the mechanical transmission of that signal, which is the outer and middle ear's job. Then there is the transduction, which is just a kind of a fancy term, I would say, for turning the mechanical stimulus into an electrical stimulus. And then there's the third stage, right, which is the neural transmission, which now that we have an electrical stimulus from because we transduced that stimulus, now we send that to the brain. So between these three stages, this is how we go from wave to brain kind of deal. And we're going to be talking about these kind of each and every one much more in depth, but that is kind of our bird's ear view of what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, we that is now just it is what it is. That's what we say.
People are
Done.
probably
Bird's ear
so
view.
like listening to this and they're like, what an awful pun, guys. Like this is such an awful.
Yeah, we've studied the MCAT way too long.
Yeah,
We find this endlessly
it's going.
entertaining.
It's going.
Okay, so yes, from that bird's ear view, we can tell that we have these key different stages, right? So let's start with stage one,
Mhm.
right? Where we just have sound waves moving through the air, or like, we talked about before, it could be through any medium, could be a liquid or a solid. How does that just physically reach the receptors that can convert that into an action potential, right? That's kind of our first stage. And in doing so, we should talk a little bit about the structure of the ear, right? Because we have an outer ear, we have the middle ear, and we have the inner ear. Okay, and they're all physically separated in a way, right? Let's start with the outer ear, right? This is what you could have piercings in, right? This is where you can customize things. It's the physical protrusion, right, outwards. And this is really not doing a ton, right? Its job is to funnel sound into the more interior portions of your ear, right? And that's pretty much it. And you see a huge variation among animals in the animal kingdom. Some animals have huge ears, some are very small. Like there are lots of different ways to shape what we call the pinna, but like external portion of the ear, to help animals or humans just again funnel sound into the eardrum. Okay, and this is so cool. The eardrum or the tympanic membrane, as you go through the auditory canal, right? You're coming in, you're being funneled into the pinna, you're going through this canal and you're bumping up against the eardrum. These are just vibrations. So we have this thin membrane that as this vibration or this, wave of energy is coming across that eardrum, it's vibrating. Okay. And it is so cool how it does this. And I feel like this is connecting us to our favorite topic, which are the ossicles. But that transmittance from the air into the tympanic membrane is what will ultimately move the things in our middle ear. Okay, so this is all part of the outer ear. We're making our way now into the inner ear, which is super exciting.
Right. I think it's really cool when you talk about the outer ear because if you were just to ask like the layperson, like, oh, what's the ear? Point to the ear, they would talk about just this portion, like just the outer, just the
Totally.
pinna, right? But that's just like honestly, and I mean this like with a lot of nuance, it's probably the one with the least function, I would say,
For
right?
sure.
Where it's kind of just like again, it's just a funnel sound into your auditory canal to your tympanic membrane. So it doesn't actually do the most other than that function. All like the real function, the real meat that the ear does is not even visible. Right? Yeah, it's so
Mhm.
cool. Like this is what people think as ears, where it's actually not that much of a function, right? And the auditory canal is kind of like how we go from the this portion into your brain. The auditory canal, that's where all the wax builds up. Like when you have like wax in your
Yeah.
ears, it's in the auditory canal. That's where you're going. You're not going anywhere past your tympanic membrane. And it's why actually because the tympanic membrane is so important, you don't want to be using things like Q-tips to be to
Yes, I
be.
know.
I it's funny.
Everyone will anyways.
Oh, everyone will anyway, but they literally on the box say don't use it to clean, don't use it to clean wax out of your ears. Yet that is like probably 90% of their business is legitimately just that one reason. But the
Yeah.
reason is because you want to get the axa ear because you need, the sound to travel in your auditory canal. But the danger is if you push too deep, you can actually damage that membrane because it's kind of like it's literally a drum. That's why they call it the eardrum, where it's like this thin membrane where you have the air particles will bounce against it. Imagine like hands slamming against a drum to transmit that signal. But what you could be doing with a Q-tip is like literally just not to this extreme, but puncturing that drum or the potential to. So this is why we always have to be careful when you're using Q-tips and why they don't recommend it. But I know everyone's listening to this and be like, I won't do that. I'm still using
I
my
know.
Q-tips. But yeah,
In one
that's
in one ear and out the other.
Oh my goodness. Again, if we're gonna be just doing puns all day, I can do
Come
it.
on, you got to keep up with me, Mike. Come on, let's
I,
go.
I don't think I can keep up with you today with these puns. You are on fire with these puns today. But right, and then now we're at the tympanic membrane, which again is vibrating, it's taking that mechanical stimulation, and it is still mechanical stimulation. Like we haven't translated it all, it's still mechanical, but this is kind of the barrier between your outer ear and now we move into the middle ear. And the middle ear, so cool. Because this is where we can talk about the ossicles. And I know Molly, I don't want to take away. I know you love talking about the ossicles, so I'll let you take it away.
They're just so tiny and
I know.
cute, right? It's
What?
the tiniest little bones in the human body. There are three that you want to know, right?
Mhm.
The Malleus, the Incus, and the Stapes, right? Or the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup, right? And they're basically these tiny little bones that are on one side right up against the tympanic membrane and on the other side right up against the oval window. Okay. And it's basically we're up against these two membranes, and as one is vibrating, those bones are vibrating and transmitting it into the next area, right? So we're in the middle ear right now, and it's literally just physically connecting the outer ear and the inner ear, essentially. But they're very cool. You should look up a picture if you have not seen it already. It's a very odd, like, it almost looks like a weird twisted arm, how it actually connects those two, the tympanic membrane and the ultimately the cochlea, which will be the part of the inner ear. But it's absolutely fascinating to talk about. And the whole idea is, again, move that vibration from one place where ultimately, right, outer ear is receiving signals from your outside environment into the cochlea where you'll actually have sensation, right? Where you'll actually create the action potential, but also it can amplify because it's very stiff. And we talked about in our last episode the fact that sound waves travel better through solids than air,
Mhm.
right? Like they absolutely do. So it will also help to amplify those vibrations. And what we'll see is as we move into the inner ear, we're going to go from that solid into fluid, actually. So
Mhm.
we're going to talk about a lot of that cool stuff. One other cool thing, I actually, most of you probably won't know this about me, but I was born and raised in Southern California. I lived in California for most of my life, right by the beach. And I have a lot of surfer friends, and also I was a swimmer and a water polo player. And just because we say that there's not really that many like cool and interesting things that happen with the outer ear, just because it's cool, right? Like most of the ear infections that you get are going to be what we call otitis media, and it's a middle ear infection, right? So that would be the region that has the Malleus incus and the stapes, right? The actual middle ear. But there are also external ear infections, right? Swimmer's ear and surfer's ear. If anyone lives by water of some kind or enjoys swimming or surfing, you've probably heard about these, right? They are different just because it's cool. Swimmer's ear, it's this idea that having frequent water entering your ear, right? Especially water that's normally like in a swimming pool, it's not super cold. It keeps your auditory canal very moist, and it actually can make it very prone to infection, right? You get frequent ear, truly infections, and you might have, antibiotic drops. If you've had an external ear infection or something you treat with drops, that's probably what it is. Surfer's ear, though, is so weird. And Mike and I were talking about this because he had not heard of this. If, you can have a true infection, surface ear is not. It's this idea where if you have really cold water frequently entering your ear, like if you're surfing in the ocean, um, your ear is essentially like get out like
Mhm.
stop. It's very irritating to your eardrum to have frequent cold exposure on your eardrum or tympanic membrane, and it actually forms these crazy bony like protrusions that actually can come across to protect the eardrum and make it more difficult to hear things. Like it's physically blocking. And if we think of the function of the external ear, it's all just to funnel sound into the tympanic membrane. I think that surfer's ear is interesting because we're jutting out with these protrusions in order to protect the tympanic membrane, but ultimately that can actually not only trap water and debris inside, against the membrane, which can cause infection, but also it deadens the sound. It can cause hearing loss. And it's not as simple as an antibiotic because you've got essentially more tiny little bones now
Mhm.
forming in your ears. Anyways, I think they're super cool. Maybe it's just the California and me, but I think those are awesome and weird.
It was one of those things where again I had never heard I grew up in kind of like more mainland. I'm like around the GTA Toronto area. Not a lot of surfing going around
Yeah.
here. And so this was not something I heard, but when I heard it, like we talked about it before, and I was like, this sounds really cool, kind of strange too, because you're like, wait a
Really
minute, you're
weird.
telling me my body in response to constant exposure decides to grow more bone? Like it's legitimately
Yeah.
extra bone, like in the auditory canal, bones are just jutting out to help protect it. But then it's funny because it actually can sometimes make it worse because now it can actually trap more water and more infection and block sound, which cool idea. For context, not MCAT content. You don't need to
Not
know. But
testable.
yeah,
Not
you're
testable,
not
just cool.
testable. It's surface area, so but it is just cool. So now you know about it. If you've heard
Mhm.
about it, if you're on the beach, now you know why that is. And it also kind of hits on this idea where you can have hearing loss as a result of maybe not the structures that, well, and we'll talk about later on the structures, but maybe sometimes you have hearing loss because the sound waves can't actually get to where they need to go, right? They're not able to get to the ossicles because they get blocked by maybe bones in your auditory canal, like in surfer's ear, or maybe a buildup of wax, or maybe an ear infection causing inflammation, right? You can have hearing loss because of these kind of like outer ear functions, or you could have middle hearing loss because of maybe something wrong with the ossicles, right? That's what we talked about was outer ear, but in the middle ear as well, if something goes wrong with those ossicles, because again, there's three bones, those the Malleus, Incus, and Stapes. If there's something wrong where maybe there's a fusion of the bones, or maybe they're fused in a way that they can't actually translate that mechanical stimulus as well, you can also have issues there. This kind of middle ear damage is known as conductive hearing loss. Because again, the problem is it just can't conduct the sound to where it needs to go, where it will be translated or transduced from mechanical to electrical. Again, it's not a problem with the conversion to electrical, it's just not getting there to where it needs to go. So this is kind of where in the outer and middle ear, again, it's just getting to where it needs to go. But if you have issues here, sometimes you can have hearing loss.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and we'll talk about cochlear implants in
Mhm.
probably a few minutes. Like there are
Mhm.
lots of interesting ways that you can respond to hearing loss, but it ultimately depends on why you have lost your hearing.
Mhm.
Why, right? Like what is the root cause? Hearing loss is is a condition, but the actual reason, right? It's a cause and effect. The reason matters if you're trying to
Mhm.
figure out how to address it or to treat it or improve that hearing sense.
Mhm.
So let's talk about it. So we've talked about the outer ear. We talked about the
Mhm.
middle ear. Again, not a ton of very like special nitty-gritty information. It's a lot of, again, just transmission. We're just moving that signal from our outside environment into where the magic happens,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And this is where we're going to talk about the cochlea. Okay, the cochlea is so cool. It's this little snail shell shaped organ in your inner ear. Okay, so when we talk about the inner ear, it's basically the cochlea that we're talking about, as well as some important organs with our vestibular sense, which we'll get into later, the semicircular canals. But the cochlea itself is again this spiral shaped structure that will actually help us convert the physical stimulus of that sound wave, right, into an electrical signal as part of our action potentials, right? So we have receptors that are sensitive to motion and movement. We call them mechanoreceptors, and this is what's ultimately going to create the action potential. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, or we're gonna keep a little distance here. We'll have our bird's ear view
Oh no.
with how these receptors actually work. If you want more info as we go through on like, well, how do ions move? How do we create an action potential? We cover that as well in our nervous system episode. So just
Which
as
we
a heads
did
up, if
so
you want to
many.
get into the nitty gritty,
Yeah.
check out that
Yeah.
one.
We covered it a while ago. So if you're like, wait a minute, I don't remember a nervous system episode recently. It was a bit ago. You know, if you just search it up, like Jack West
Yeah,
MCAT podcast nervous system, you
yeah.
will find it. Check it out if you feel struggle like, wait, I don't understand how depolarization works, or how
Yeah,
do I
yeah, yeah,
get from electrical signal or mechanical signal to electrical? Go check that out. But
yeah.
either way, I think when we talk about the organ of Corti, it's important to talk about like the structures within this snail shell. I love the visual of like the snail shell. You're kind of thinking of this spiraling snail shell. If you kind of zoomed in to one of those rows of the snail shell, I don't know how to describe it, like one of those like sections of the snail shell. There's kind of three components that it's very important that you know what these three components are. The first thing are the hair cells. Now, when I'm saying hair cells, I'm not talking about, hair on your head or if you're someone like myself or your face. No, no, no. We're not talking about those kinds of hair, right? We're talking about these miniature hair cells within, actually embedded within the organ of Corti. And we'll talk about how these hair cells are significant. But before we dive into the hair cells, we need to know that there's two very important membranes. And a lot of times when we teach this, right, that we have a great visual where you can actually see the different membranes. Editors, if we could put up an image for anyone visual, but there are two membranes known as the tectorial membrane and the basilar membrane. Now, the hair cells are embedded in the basilar membrane. And the kind of bottom of the hair cells, the cell itself are in the basilar membrane, and you can just imagine like the hair cells jut out of that basilar membrane. But then on the top, kind of on top of that membrane, on those hair cells, they're embedded, they stick into what's known as the tectorial membrane. So you kind of have a hair cell fixed at 2 points. The top of it is embedded in the tectorial membrane, the bottom is in the basilar membrane, and the hair cell is kind of like jutting out in between. It's very important that you note that this hair cell is stuck in between these two for when we talk about signal transduction.
It's almost while you were saying this, it's like the basilar membrane has the actual base. It's where it's attached, but the tectorial, when you said it, I was like, that sounds like tactile, which is touch. It's like they're
Mhm.
touching the
Mhm.
tectorial membrane, but they're based in the basilar membrane.
Cool. I like that. I never thought of it. I love that. Okay.
I hadn't either, but you saying it, I was like, wait a minute, hey, that could maybe be helpful if you're trying
hmm
to learn.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, we're talking about hair cells. How is this hair cell going to detect sound, right?
hmm
Like, how does this work? And it all comes back down to those ossicles, right, that are
hmm
so important. We kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, right? We went from sound waves traveling in air, probably. Most of our life
Probably.
is, right, terrestrial, non-aquatic, right? Sound waves are traveling through air. They're vibrating that tympanic membrane and then being transmitted to those ossicles, which are obviously solids, and they're bumping up against that oval window, right? The cochlea is full of fluid. Okay, when you have that sound wave that's being basically transmitted through the ossicles, bumping on that oval window, we're creating waves in the fluid now.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's where these hair cells come in. Because if you imagine, again, I grew up right by the beach. If you imagine how like seaweed moves in the ocean, right? You have waves. The seaweed is moving backwards and forwards. It's flowing because of the energy that is being transmitted to it through the water, right? Um, and that's exactly what these hair cells do. And it's basically as the fluid wave comes through the cochlea, those hair cells are bending and flowing as they go through. And that stimulus is what actually creates the action potential, which is so, so cool. And we could
Mhm.
talk about a lot, but I feel like it's important to just go step by step. Like, how does this work? Start to
Mhm.
finish, right? Like, what do we see? Because there are trends that we could talk about what kind of sound is heard in different places, but like, take us through just step by step, like, how do we create the movement? How is that converted into an action potential? How do we hear?
I'm so glad you asked. Well, let's start again at the kind of where we left off in the middle ear, right? We had the ossicles, like you said, and the last ossicle is the stapes, right? Kind of looks like a stirrup if you looked at a picture. It's kind of cool. And it's up against that oval window. And now essentially it pushes on the oval window. Because again, if we recall a sound wave, it's a wave that's just pushing the particles. Again, they're traveling parallel to the transaction. So they just push on the ossicles, and then the stapes just pushes on that oval window. Then the oval window then will also push on the fluid, right? And that causes that pressure wave to move through the cochlear fluid. Now, when we talked about the cochlea, it looks like this little kind of like seashell. So that the fluid will go through it. It'll kind of rotate around the path, right? It'll go all the way through because it's all filled with fluid. Now, when it gets to the right frequency, when it gets to the right point, and then we'll talk about the different theories, but when it gets to the right place where it's supposed to be, it will cause a vibration we talked about the two membranes, in the basilar membrane. Because if you're thinking the hair cell is embedded in both the top and the bottom, it will then cause the basilar membrane to shift. Now, if the top of the hair cell, right, is embedded in the tectorial membrane and the basilar membrane shifts and vibrates, now that hair cell is now on an angle. Because before, the hair cell was straight up. It was straight up, not doing anything. But now as soon, like kind of like you were saying before, as soon as it bends like a seaweed, that's what actually opens a channel. Now, this is so important because these hair cells are what we call mechanically gated ion channels. Now, when we talk about mechanically gated, you might remember kind of a term we talked about in the nervous cells known as the voltage gated ion channels. And when we talk
Or
about
ligand gated.
or ligand gated, we also talk about those in the nerve cells. Whenever we talk about gated, that just means how does it get activated or how does it become open? Voltage gated means, oh, hey, when you reach a certain voltage, you're going to open. Ligand gated means when you get a certain ligand or some sort of thing that binds to you, then you'll open. Mechanically gated means, hey, if you receive some sort of actual mechanical stimulation, then you'll open. For the hair cells, it's going from being straight up to bent. As soon as it becomes bent, it actually physically opens the channels. It's not a reaction, it's really physically forcing the channel open, and that opening of the channels because the hair cell bends is what causes ions to flow through, particularly potassium. Potassium, these are mechanically gated potassium channels. Potassium will flow into the kind of the hair cells, right? And positive ions going into the cell causes the membrane potential to rise, which we call depolarization, and that is what causes a potential. And that depolarization, that increasing of the membrane potential of these hair cells, is what actually leads to neurotransmitter release. And this is what we've just done is we've translated, right, our bending, our mechanically bending into that electrical signal because now we have a neurotransmitter release which will bind to a neuron and cause an action potential. And again, if you're like neurotransmitter to binding to a neuron causing action potential, go check out our nervous system episode and we can really dive into the specifics. But I think once we get to this point, and if you understand the nerve cells, it's like, oh, now we have an action potential, right? And this is kind of like these steps. If you understand these steps, you have got the inner ear down. You understand how we can go from mechanical stimulation to electrical signal, which is the coolest.
Yeah. And I
Mhm.
feel like, once we get an action potential, we're going to talk about quite a few senses, right? We have several, right?
Mhm.
Once you create an action potential, from there, it's going to travel to the brain. It's going to be, right, unpacked. It's going to, you're going to be able to interpret what the signal is like. You'll be able to make decisions about how to respond to it, etc., right? Like once you make an action potential, you're pretty much, I shouldn't say smooth sailing, right? Because there are lots of ways that you can mess with that sense downstream of that, but it's pretty similar, right? The flow of that information after you create the action potential. So if you understand what happens previously, that's what you want to know most about the
Yeah.
sensation of hearing, right? Or how that translation occurs between a sound wave and the generation of an electrical signal. So super cool. I think that's very high yield material. Some other things that we want to think about. One, if you are exposed to very loud sounds, Mike and I were talking about we both at least used to attend concerts fairly frequently. We still
Mhm.
go, but like
Mhm.
especially earlier, right? Like loud music going right up next to the artist, like, you know, very loud, right next to the speakers, etc. What is that going to do? Right? We're
Mhm.
going to talk about this in a sec, but if you have incredibly loud sounds, right, what that's going to do is create very extreme vibrations,
Mhm.
right? Because the sound waves coming into your outer ear, focused on your eardrum, are very intense, which means your ossicles are moving very intensely, which means you're smashing that oval window very intensely,
Mashing.
which is your cochlea, your poor cochlea is, like, in a crazy ocean wave, right? Like very, very intense, like a tsunami, right? And one thing that I want to mention is these hair cells don't regenerate. If you overstress them and create damage within your hair cells, you're out of luck, right? Like they're not going to come back, right? So there's what we call noise-induced hearing loss. Okay, it's
Mm,
not hearing loss due to an infection. It's not because you ruptured your eardrum. It's not for any other reason but that you literally just you didn't protect your ears when you were out in very loud environments. This is also why oftentimes individuals in, let's say, like construction, wear protective ear equipment, right? You want to protect from excessively loud noises because they will damage your hair cells and they don't come back. That's
mm,
permanent. Okay, again, we'll touch on cochlear implants in a little bit and whether or not they could
mm,
help, but you can't regenerate this, right? There's no cure for it. The hair cell dies, it's not coming back.
mm,
Um, and this kind of brings us to how we understand sound. Okay, I
mm.
think we've established pretty clearly how do sound waves create action potentials? That said, right, the sound of a opera singer sounds very different than the sound of construction equipment, right? Or the piano or the guitar or your best friend's voice, right? Like how do we determine what one sound is versus another, right? How do our cochleas detect differences in sound? Walk us through.
I would be happy to, Molly. And when we're talking about how our ears kind of pick up sound, you're totally right. Because it's not just enough to say, oh, it's sound wave to electrical signal, because we know not all sounds are the same. So how does our brain recognize not all sounds are the same? And there's kind of two aspects, especially the MCAT will want you to know, and that we talked about last episode that sound very much varies in, which is pitch, which is the frequency of the sound, as well as loudness, the amplitude of the sound. We need to figure out how do I know, how can my brain detect, or my ear essentially detect different frequencies, right? And this is based on a certain theory. Now, there are like a few theories on this, but the most MCAT relevant theory is known as what's called place theory, otherwise known as basilar tuning, otherwise known as tonotopic mapping. These are all essentially the exact same thing. And the idea is that your basilar membrane we talked about before is this very long membrane. Again, it curls because of the cochlea, curls, looks like a seashell, but not all areas of that membrane are the same. Rather, we talked about, the sound wave causing hair cells bending, but it's the idea that only certain regions of the basilar membrane respond to certain frequencies. Like when you hear a sound, when you hear a certain frequency, not the entire basilar membrane is going to respond. Only certain parts are going to shift and going to bend. And based on which part shifts or bends, that is the area, that's what will kind of code the frequency. And so there's kind of two parts of the cochlea. There's the base, which is kind of like the thick initial part, and there's the apex, which is kind of the very end, kind of in the middle of the cochlea. And anything that kind of shifts the base of the cochlea, imagine it's really, really thick. So to shake it, you need to like kind of push really hard or a lot. Those are anything that's high frequency. And over at the apex is kind of like a thinner part of the cochlea. Those are much lower frequency sounds. So if you cause a vibration or a frequency or a kind of shifting of the basilar membrane at the base, you detect a high frequency. At the apex, you detect a low frequency. This is known as the place theory of kind of frequency coding, which is really, really cool.
I love that the way that your brain like internalizes that information comes from a thickness approach. Like the
Mm,
base is thicker than the apex, so you need a more forceful wave to create that vibration. I love that because I always think actually, rather than in terms of like energy of that
mhm.
wave, I always think about like the wavelength of the sound wave, right? Like what we
Oh.
say is higher pitch, which would mean very a smaller wavelength, right? Takes or is determined or encoded at the base, whereas the apex is so much farther in.
Mm.
And that has the really low frequency sound. So I always just think of it in terms of wavelength, right? Like if you have a really, really tiny wavelength, you are probably going to smash against the cochlear walls very early versus if it's a
Yeah.
very long, very gentle wavelength, because a very low frequency sound, you would travel all the way down through all the little twists and turns of the essentially snail shell into the apex. Which I mean, it they both make sense, but I
They
love. I love the way that our brains work differently, Mike, because I always feel like, when we chat about things like this, I'm like, oh yeah, huh,
That
I didn't think
I
about
learned
it that
so
way.
I'm like there's so many times where I'm like I've never thought about that, but I'm stealing that. Like I'm using that for
Yeah.
now. But yeah, I think this is such a great place for that. So yeah, and I think and again, I really like to preface this is just one theory about hearing, but this is the one that the MCAT really wants you to know. Like they're
Yeah.
I think they have a little bit of a bias towards this one. And hey, we'll take it. If you want to look on your own time, there's another theory known as the frequency theory. But this is the place theory, where different
Yeah.
places of the basilar membrane will kind of respond to different frequencies.
Yeah.
But now that's only one half of the picture, really, because now
Hmm.
okay, now I know how different frequencies. Now I can get the pitch of my sound based on where in the membrane. But now, how do I detect loudness? And now this is the idea we kind of were kind of alluding to before when both of us do enjoy concerts. We used to go to concerts way, way more often. Now we don't exactly have as much of a time, but a good concert is never a bad thing. But when you hear louder sounds, well, if it's all the same pitch, it's going to be in the same area of the basilar membrane, but louder amplitudes, like louder sounds, will lead to more hair cells bending. Where something's quiet, all right, might have a few hair cells that bend, but if you are really loud, you will cause a lot of hair cell bending. So therefore, kind of more depolarization, more potassium coming into those cells, and therefore more neurotransmitters being released, leading to more frequent action potentials, not stronger action potentials because it's an all or nothing thing, but just more frequent action potentials, which lead to kind of more louder things. And this is why, if you have such extreme amounts of bending, like all the time, you're frequently exposing yourself to loud sounds, like your hair cells can become physically damaged because of extreme bending. And like Molly, you put it well, right? These don't heal, right? If you damage your hair cells, it's kind of game over, really. So, I mean, not for all of your hearing, but for that region of your hearing, absolutely. And so, frequency based on where the bending happens, amplitude or loudness is based on how much bending happens.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, like you said, it all comes down to the fact that action potentials are all or nothing,
Mhm.
right? A tiny little whisper versus a scream, right? It's
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
same size. The action potential generated. The question is how many,
Mhm.
right? What is the frequency of the generation of those action potentials, right? That's what will tell your brain volume, right? Or loudness of a sound. So location is all pitch, right? And the frequency is all about volume, right? And at this point, we're ready to talk about, what did I say?
Frequency is about pitch.
Well, oh, I should. Okay, I'm saying frequency, meaning how
How
frequent the
often?
action potentials are. You're right. That's a bad term to use. Frequency of the sound wave is pitch, right? Which
Gosh.
is based on the place that you get in the cochlea. The frequency, meaning how often the action potentials are generated, that is based on the volume.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
I was
There are
like,
two different meanings of
I
frequency.
know. I was like, I know you know. I was like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Let me to think that you're no, yes,
Yes. No.
absolutely, absolutely.
Good to good to clarify. And now we're at a place where we could talk about how we move to the brain and what we've been kind of dancing around, which is cochlear implants, which is super
Mhm.
cool. But essentially, we create these signals in the cochlea. Okay, then you're going to be moving through or being, I guess, taking those signals from the cochlea, going through the auditory nerve, actually up through the brainstem to the thalamus, and then you go to the auditory cortex within the temporal lobe. Okay, and this is really where you are going to put this sound into context. You're going to consciously become aware of it, etc. You'll decide how you want to respond to it. You can actually orient to the sound because you have two ears and you're getting sound signals that are slightly different. Your temporal lobe in that auditory context can take both sounds or both inputs from both ears and determine where is this sound coming from. Super cool. But this also brings in a lot more places where we could potentially have problems,
Mhm.
right? Like we talked about, hey, we could have outer ear issues where the vibrations from the air just literally are not being transmitted to the eardrum. Okay. That could be a problem and you're not going to hear. Okay. It could be a middle ear infection or a problem with your ossicles, right? That could also create hearing loss. It could be an inner ear problem, like damage to your hair cells, etc. That's also could cause hearing loss. Okay, if you have auditory nerve damage, that can cause hearing loss. Or if you have an actual brain issue, that could cause hearing loss. And actually, my mom had an acoustic neuroma, which is
Oh,
technically a brain tumor, non-cancerous. She's
oh,
completely fine. But
goodness.
um, in order to, it's basically a tumor, a benign tumor that's right up against her brainstem. Um,
Mm,
but in her inner ear, and when they removed it, they had to cut her auditory nerve. She's going to be forever deaf in one ear, right? When we
mm,
talk about what ways you have to address hearing loss, the key thing is if it's a problem before a nerve, you're pretty much fine. Cochlear implant can take electrical signals, right?
mm,
Basically, you can have a cochlea
mm,
that can help generate that action potential and communicate to the brain, hey, you have sound. If it's an issue with your hair cells, if it's an issue with your outer ear or middle ear, no problem. Cochlear implant can fix it. But again, if the issue is your auditory nerve or anything internal with your brain, there's really no fix for it. Again,
mm,
my mom, in order to get that tumor out, they had to cut through her auditory nerve.
mm,
So a cochlear implant's not going to help very much.
mm,
Very, very interesting. Again, lots of reasons why you could have hearing loss.
mm,
And sometimes there are ways around it, and sometimes there are not. And it
mm,
all
mm.
depends on where along that auditory pathway you've got issues.
Right.
So kind of cool.
It's kind of cool. I'm glad your mom's okay.
Yeah, she's
But
she's fine. She's a great
wonderful.
sport about only being able to hear. She can't localize sound. She's she's hilarious. She's a great sport about it.
Mm.
Yeah, very glad that it wasn't a cancerous
Anything
brain tumor
serious,
for
yeah.
sure.
But yeah, no, and it's very, very cool because when we talk about, even when it comes to, old age, right? We could talk about kind of
Yeah.
like cochlear kind of hearing implants. Because, as we talk about age, something that you can do, and maybe I know I did a lot when I was younger, but I don't know, have you ever done one of those like hearing age tests where you can like test how old your ears are?
I think I have, but it's like all depending on the frequencies that you
It's
can hear,
all
right?
dependent
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
frequencies because it determines that based on the frequency you can hear. And you're like, wait a minute, how does frequency of hearing determine your age? Because there's this cool thing that occurs. Like as you age, as everything with age, certain cells aren't going to live that whole time. That's why gray hair occurs because the cells that are responsible for dyeing your hair essentially end up essentially dying. And so same thing with your and like your hair cells in your ear, but they don't all go at the same time. Rather, it's the high frequency areas of their basilar membrane that end up going first before the lower frequency areas. And that's why, based on which pitches, which frequencies you can hear, you kind of can be assigned an inner ear age, like how old are your ears, and that's just based on like averages. But that's why they do it based on pitch. Like if you can hear a certain pitch, if you stop hearing the pitch at a certain point, it's like, oh, you're at this point here. The ones before that are kind of, have kind of been destroyed or died. Hmm.
Honestly, and this, yeah, it's so interesting. And evolutionary biology and me, I have to bring it up. Different animals and different, hearing creatures,
Yeah.
they can perceive and actually I should say sense sounds at different pitches. And it's not
Mm.
because they have magical, completely different organs in many cases. They have the same system. However, they have very different shapes and features of their cochlea, such
Mm.
that they are receptive to different pitches of sound. Like a dog, for instance, can hear a way wider range of sound than we can, right? Like a dog would have a great, hearing age test. A dog would be like,
So young, like younger than zero. How does that work? How
yeah,
does
wait,
that...
what? It's the best hearing in the world. Yeah, but they just have cochlea that are shaped such that they can perceive and detect sounds at a much higher frequency than we can. And it all just has to do with the properties of their cochlea. Same structure, really, but it's different features within it that allow them to hear at a much broader range of hertz, which
Mhm.
again is the unit for frequency, 1/seconds. Anyways, I had to throw that in there, especially I have two dogs at home and they bark at things that don't exist all the time. And my brain is like, it's either a ghost in my house is haunted or it's some super high frequency sound that they hear that I just can't.
I'm going with the ghost. I'm gonna be honest. I think it's probably the
Honestly,
ghost.
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
probably haunted.
probably.
It's
You
fine.
probably have a haunted house. You did. Fun fact: Molly did just move, so maybe haunted house.
That's true. That is true. It's okay. We'll be
But,
friends. It's fine.
We'll be friends in the ghost. But yeah, so that's kind of like we've kind of like now covered like, we now from mechanical sensation, waves, little particles just vibrating at different frequencies in the air to electrical signal in the ear. And based on the location of the basilar membrane and how much you're bending, that kind of codes, okay, what kind of hearing you're going to go. It's going to go kind of through the auditory nerve, you're going to go through your thalamus, and then kind of synapse onto your auditory cortex, which is kind of like the area of the brain, specifically in the temporal lobe, where we talked about our kind of lobes kind of before, but the temporal lobe, the ones on the sides, those are the ones normally associated with hearing. Right, so it's going to synapse there. Also, very fun fact, I don't think we kind of pointed out, we talked about before about how there's like the lateralization of brain function, how normally senses on the left side are picked up by the right, senses on the right side are picked up by the left. When it comes to hearing, though, it's not actually, oh, sounds in the right ear only go to the left side of your auditory, like the left auditory cortex. They actually lead to both sides. The signal actually splits, and so the sound from your right ear does actually go to both the left and right auditory cortex, not both, not just one. So that's kind of a fun fact to add about kind of when we're talking about going from the actual like stimulation to brain, leading to perception. It's both sides. But I don't just like to end our conversation about ears on hearing because there's another very important function of the ear, which is all about balance and the vestibular system. And we all know balance or about balance and how we can change our balance because all of us did this as kids. We would all spin around as fast as we could. And then Molly's like, I want to spin. No. Well, we all did this. I remember so vividly. I was like, oh, what do you mean if I spin, I'll fall over? Let me try it. And then I would just spin in the gymnasium. And I'm like, oh my goodness, why can't I not stand straight? And it's because of the structures in our ear, which we're going to be talking about, which I think are the coolest things.
I completely agree with you, and I feel like it's so fun. I'm the youngest of five, but I have three older brothers, and they love to play the game of how fast can you spin around until you want to throw up. And they actually just loved having me spin around to see how much
Ah.
I could spin before I felt like I was going to throw up. They didn't do the spinning. Actually, they sometimes spun my chair, right?
Oh.
But but again, how does this work? And
Hmm.
ultimately, we've actually already talked about a lot of the mechanics because at
Hmm.
the end of the day, not only is this something that's still part of your ear, but it's also fluid based. And
Hmm.
you essentially are detecting movement in that fluid with mechanoreceptors. Okay, what
Hmm.
they're called and how they're shaped is very different,
Hmm.
but it's still fluid, moving things that ultimately lead to active potentials. And
Yeah.
I want to hit out one thing before we get into the specifics of how this works, and it's this idea of balance. Balance as an idea is a very, we'll call it interdisciplinary context. Okay, in your sense of balance comes from a lot of different things. Okay, yes, the vestibular organs with the semicircular canals, etc., right, that are part of your ear, but also visual stimuli, also stretch receptors in your muscles that detect position of your body in space, right, and more. Okay, so, and of course, we know balance and coordination and things like that are involved in other brain regions like the cerebellum, etc. Balance as an idea is very complex,
Hmm.
right? So when we talk about semicircular canals, what we're specifically talking about is the vestibular sense, which has a lot to do with acceleration and rotation, right?
Hmm.
Especially of the head. Okay, so I want to
Hmm.
make sure that we talk about
Yes.
that
Yeah.
because it's very,
Hmm.
very complex. And even the sense of dizziness that you get when you spin around and you stop
Hmm.
and you feel like you're going to throw up, it's because your eyes are saying that you're still and your body is saying that
It's
you're
like
still, and yet
you're.
all that fluid is still moving around in your ears.
Hmm.
Dizziness often comes from when the different inputs that connect to balance as an idea don't match up. Okay, the brain's like,
Right.
what's going on?
What's
What's
happening?
going
Why
on?
am I getting all these
I
different
don't
inputs?
get
Right.
it.
And
Yeah.
so I think now we can kind of dive into the structures because then once we know the structures, we can actually kind of contextualize that because again, we know, right? You're like you put it before, your eyesight is involved with balance. Your proprioception, we got like receptors, like proprioceptors that are involved in balance, but there's also the ears. And I think the first one that we should talk about, since I think the mechanism is really similar to your hearing, are the semicircular canals. Because these are the kind of canals, if you actually looked at it on a diagram, they're very, very cool. There are these round structures, and there's three of them. And again, I don't think the MCAT kind of really focuses on their names, more so that what their purpose is. And their idea is that there's three of them all in kind of each direction. You kind of have a vertical rotation one, you have a horizontal one that's kind of round, and you have a diagonal one. And the job of the semicircular canals is to detect really rotational movement and kind of rotational acceleration, which we call angular acceleration. So anything that has to do with rotation is involved in semicircular canals. Makes sense because they're round, right? Anything to do with rotation has to do with them. And how they work is because when you rotate, when you're accelerating, the fluid is going to be moving like we talked about before, right? When it came to hearing, the fluid moving was caused by pressure waves due to the sound, but here in the semicircular canals, the fluid moving is due to your head accelerating and moving, right? Because it's accelerating, it's the exact same mechanism where the fluid is going to be pushing and hey, they're back. The hair cells are going to bend, and based on their bending, they will tell your brain, hey, you are rotating. It's why if you closed your eyes and you rotated your head, you can sense that you're rotating your head because of the function of the semicircular canals. They are all about rotational movement and rotational acceleration. But again, it's still hair cells bending, mechanoreceptor opening, positive ions going in, causing an action potential. So that's on the semicircular canals. But then we've talked about rotational acceleration, rotational movement. But does your body sense that? Like, say you're closing your eyes, that you're moving back, moving forwards, moving backwards, moving side to side, moving up and down. And that is, I think, the coolest things, which are the otolith organs. I love the otolith organs. Now, when you look at otolith, it's really like I'm pretty sure the Latin of it is rock, right? It's like just like rock organs, where there's these two otolith organs known as the utricle and the saccule, and their job is to to tell your brain, are you accelerating in the horizontal plane or in the vertical plane linearly? Again, semicircular canals were all about rotation, things going in circles. Otolith organs are all about linear, up and down, left and right, forward and backwards. Where the utricle is more for I believe the utricle is the horizontal movement, and the saccule is all about vertical movement. And how they do that are these little rocks embedded in jelly, right? It's kind of the weirdest thing. But there's these little odd, like these little rocks in jelly where once you accelerate forward, you can just imagine what happens when you like slam on the car, right? Say you're in a car and you slam on the gas, your head goes backwards, right? Because you're accelerating forwards. That's exactly what happens in your ear, where if you're accelerating forward, the little rocks embedded in jelly will move in the opposite direction. And that will bend hair cells, right? Because because there's a similar membrane, hair cells embedded in that jelly, which will now bend and say, hey, we are moving in this direction. Same idea with the saccule, except that is up and down, where now it's going to cause a bending of the hair cells because the rocks will move in the opposite direction you're moving, cause hair cells bending, and tell your brain or cause signals to say, hey, you're actually moving up and down. So while the semicircular canals kind of pick up rotational movement and rotational acceleration, the otolith organs, the utricle and the saccule, they're all about linear acceleration in the vertical and horizontal directions.
Yes.
Hmm.
And again, this is one of many inputs that we have in order to figure out what the heck is going on
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
our surroundings,
Hmm.
right? In terms of, how should we move? How should we coordinate our body responses to make sure that we stay standing or
Hmm.
sitting or laying down, right? It's like this idea of balance takes so many different components into play. Okay, but I think it's really valuable to cover the vestibular sense with hearing because again, all the organs are connected. And I
Hmm.
encourage you to look up what the cochlea looks like because you'll see the little snail shell portion that we talk about, and then you'll see all the loops of the semicircular canals, and you'll also see the otoliths in there as well, especially if you have a labeled diagram. I love looking at the semicircular canals because to me it looks like a roller coaster. Like you go up and around in all these different
Yeah.
directions, but it's all to just help you figure out how is my body oriented in space and how is it moving?
Hmm.
So really, really cool there. And again, it's all the same basic principle. Something moves fluid, fluid moves cell or receptor, receptor creates action potential, brain interprets action potential. Or I should say, action potential travels to the brain and then brain interprets it.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's very, very similar in location and also in basic activation pattern, but what they're being activated by is very different. So
Hmm.
if we're thinking, how is this going to show up on the MCAT, right? There are actually a lot of different ways it could show up. You definitely get a lot of questions about the objective, um, the process of transmitting, let's say, sound into an action potential, right? So understanding the basilar and the tectorial membrane, understanding things like place theory, they're very important, right? An ion channel question could show up in biochem. You could also get questions in chem phys relating to the properties of sound. And of course, you could see it in psych soc. So very important. These senses can show up everywhere, except cars, probably.
Probably not.
And also, again, oftentimes they'll tell you a certain part of this hearing pathway is broken for this reason. Why?
Hmm.
Why does this create hearing loss? How could you address this hearing loss? Again, you don't need to be like a medical professional yet, but you want to be using the material that we've covered today to reason through, well, again, would something like a cochlear implant help? Right? Like what is the problem? Right? Why are hearing cells damaged due to loud noises? Things like that. I think that's a pretty important question. So like if you are hearing if you are hearing that you have hearing loss, is it a physical or mechanical problem, or is it a neurological problem? I'd say that's probably the biggest decision to make. And once you've made that, you've got your footing under you, I think it's easier to move forward.
Right, with the question, right? And that
Yeah.
kind of like I think concludes our kind of conversation on like hearing and balance and anything with the ear. But again, it's so important that you don't just listen to us when we talk about it, that you practice it on your own. Go over your own notes, right? Correspond what we've said with your notes, make sure it makes sense, and then do practice problems on it. Again, there's so many times that you can practice this, so many places. Again, like we said, it can show up in psych soc, it can show up in chem phys because of the waves, it can show up in bio because of the anatomy. Right, this is just one of those topic areas where there's so many opportunities to see it. And that kind of really also carries in to what we're talking about next episode. Because next episode is going to be very similar to last episode, where we're going to take a step back from the brain and the sensations for a little bit to talk about something you need to understand before we get to the next sensation, which is optics. We're going to be discussing optics next episode. We're going to be talking about how light bends, focuses, how do the lenses versus mirrors work? How does that all work? And then once we talk about that, then you could probably guess what we'll talk about in the episode after that. So I'm super excited because this is a topic that I feel like way too many people memorize. So I'm excited to like talk about like how to actually understand optics so you can take on questions on this exam.
Me too.
Mhm.
Can't wait. Um, Thank you guys for listening. Hopefully you found it insightful. Lots of, information at a bird's ear view.
Oh
And
no.
I had to bring it up one more time. Um, we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day whenever we catch you. And until next time, happy studying, everybody.
Bye everyone.